Hello, everybody, and happy Tuesday. Welcome to this APN webinar. I am Hadar Suskind. I'm the president and CEO of Americans for Peace Now, and I am thrilled to have you joining us. For those of you who are regulars, you know this is the part where I filibuster a little bit because it takes a moment or two for everybody to get through the system and get added to the webinar. So, of course, I will introduce my wonderful guests in just a minute. But I am really glad to have you all here with us. Let's take a quick look. While we're waiting, I will do a little bit of the housekeeping. And again, I'll remind everybody else again, but just to let you all know, the webinar, as always, is going to be recorded. We will upload it to our YouTube channel. We will share it across our social media, etc. And of course, we will take the audio file and turn it into an episode of our podcast, Peacecast. So that's always good. As you probably know, you are welcome and encouraged to ask questions. In order to do so, we use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So if you have questions, please click on the button, ask your questions. We will get to as many of them as we can. We try to keep them focused on the content of the webinar, so please do so. All right, let's see, we're getting there on our numbers. So again, I will just say hello, thank you, welcome. I am Hadar Suskind. I'm the president and CEO of Americans for Peace Now. With me today is my colleague, Madeline Cheragino, our government relations director, and our special guests. And those very special guests, and thank you, hi guys, are Dan Kalick and Stacey Burdett. I'll give you a quick intro of each of them. Stacey is a friend and first and most important, a strategist and really a thought leader. Her bio she sent us says that she helps thought leaders, but I think that is an understatement. She is a thought leader, and she works with advocates, with corporate leaders, and all kinds of organizations really focused on fighting anti-Semitism, fighting bigotry, and I will say partnering with us, working on really unpacking not only anti-Semitism, but also the issues around the weaponization of anti-Semitism and what that means. She's worked for many, many years, was as the Vice President for Government Relations at the ADL, Vice President for Government Relations, Advocacy, and Community Engagement, because they have long titles there. She's testified before Congress, led national campaigns, built coalitions, and been a great partner for many years. Dan, also a friend, hi Dan, joined Move On as their senior political advisor back in 2018, where he oversees the federal election programs, federal affairs programs, national partnerships, and of course advises on foreign policy. And Dan came to Move On after a long time, we'll see how long, serving as the chief of staff and previously the national political director at J Street, where we had the pleasure of working together. So thank you, Stacey, thank you, Dan. And we're really glad to have both of you with us here. So what are we doing here? We are here today to talk about the shift in Congress around Israel-Palestine and the politics around Israel-Palestine. And there have been many, many, and I'm sure many of you have been on them, conversations about what that has looked like over the last decade and a half. Most of them, very importantly and quite rightly, are focused on how we on the left have built more power in Congress. And APN has played a role in that. Obviously, our colleagues at J Street and the electoral and political work they do there has played a role, and so many of the other organizations. But this conversation is going to be a little bit different because it's not a conversation about the left. It's not a conversation primarily around the changes in the Democratic Party, although we may talk about that too. But it's really about looking at the Republican Party and the conservative side of our own community and those who define themselves as part of the pro-Israel community. So to kick off that conversation, I want to hear, why don't we start with Stacey maybe, your thoughts on really how the parties have evolved and changed in recent years.
Well, I think both parties, especially elected representatives, follow the lead of their constituencies, their supporters, issue groups, and their donors. And for so many years, the issues of anti-Semitism in Israel and really even Soviet Jewry, they were in a uniform issue category in a political organization. And what has changed is that we as a community have been caught up in an incredibly caustic and hyper-partisan political debate. And you know, we, like other Americans, feel like if you disagree with me on one thing, you don't represent my values, you're my enemy. And so in general, for all of us, it feels impossible to be nuanced on any issue without worrying that we're going to be branded as weak. It's just hard for us to compromise. And I think we are the mirror that reflects on how the political parties are changing with respect to our issues. So we've all seen, in the Democratic caucus or among liberals broadly, which is where most Jews find their political and ideological home, the party has very diverse views because the Jewish community has diverse views. And there is a multitude of ways that Democrats can approach support for Israel and support for Palestinian rights. Because for a majority of Jewish voters, in some way, our support for our identity, whether it's Zionism or our identity as a supporter of Israel, it lives side by side with our support for human rights mechanisms and empathy for Palestinian aspirations. The Republican side has a much smaller Jewish constituency. It's a group of supporters that are very, very cohesive around a hardline view on Israel, on issues like Iran, on anti-Semitism. And in that part of the community and the Republican Party, hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism are very frequently merged into one thing, which is not how I think most of us feel about it. And this gives the Republican Party room to really run with the issue, because their supporters in the Jewish community not only support the hard line that they take, but this is very important. Their Jewish supporters or Jews who are engaging with Republicans on issues, when a non-Jewish elected representative from the Midwest is running full speed ahead on your issue, it's very intimidating to say, that's a little too much for me. I didn't mean that. And very few people have the courage to do it. And so at this point, and I've definitely had members of Congress and Hill staffers suggest to me, put me on the spot as an advocate and question whether I or the organization I represent are defending the Jewish people adequately. So if you're a Republican, you have room to run. And then our issues multitask for you, because you can satisfy a smaller number of supporters that are much more hardline than the majority of Jewish voters. And you can also draw blood from your opponents. And it's been an irresistible temptation and a concerted strategy. And it's been working very well for the Republicans. So I believe the two parties respond to us. We are divided and hyperpartisan, and they use the polarization in two different ways.
Thanks for getting us started, Stacey. I really appreciate everything you brought to this conversation. Hopefully we can get into more of a conversation later. And Hadar, Madeline, APN, thanks for having me. It's probably been 4.5 years since I was working on this set of issues day by day. So I ask all of you to give me some grace. I'm not reading every article like I used to, but also I think having some distance while still working really closely with Congress, the White House, and in federal elections, hopefully gives me some, arm's length perspective that adds a little color to the conversation. And before I answer a question, I just need to take a moment to remember our good friend, Sid Topol. Sid was a friend, a mentor, a thought leader to me, to so many of us on this call. And whether it was emailing me in all caps or saying it to my face with his Red Sox hat, he always said, keep your eyes on the prize, Dan, keep your eyes on the prize. And I've taken that with me to all the work I do outside of Israel-Palestine, whether it's on economic justice, voting rights, or electing Democrats and progressives. So I just had to say something about Sid, who passed this past week and lived a very good 97-year life. The actual question. I think we know the common refrain, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? Like, we're an argumentative people. We have a lot of opinions. We don't agree with each other. But for decades in DC, at least from the perspective of elected officials, whether it was Congress or those folks in the White House, when it came to Israel, there was basically one Jewish voice. And I'm going to say it was AIPAC. I think when you work in Congress, you have to deal with 100 issues, right? You have to deal with healthcare, you have to deal with climate, you have to deal with Israel. And the best thing for a congressional staffer to know is, who's the group I go to? Oh, it's the climate, I'll talk to Sierra Club. Oh, it's a worker issue, I'm going to talk to the AFL. Israel, I can talk to AIPAC. And it made it easier for them. And what AIPAC did, I think, was try to reinforce the view that despite Jews having 3 opinions on everything, when it came to US-Israel relations and how Israel should relate to its neighbors, there's only one view, and every person with a Jewish surname that has ever voted for you, donated to your campaign, volunteered for your campaign, agrees with that. They agrees with AIPAC on what the red line should be on Iran and how we should, what constitutes the best way to prevent them from nuclear weapons, or, maybe what's the greatness of Israel's startup economy. And, whatever their view was, that was the view, and people just took it with a grain of salt. I think what's happened, particularly over the last decade, is on the left and the right, we've seen a fracturing, a splintering of views. And I think that's become easier across issue sets. We have segmented media, we have segmented social, that you can surround yourself with people that agree with you, and that allows more opinions to break through, not just in society, but with Congress. On the Democratic side, which I think I'm more of an expert on, thank you, Hadar, I don't think anyone's ever asked me to comment anything about the Republican Party since I know so little about them. But on the Democratic side, I think it's actually, I'm seeing more alignment on the Israel-Palestine issue than I've seen in a long time. I think people see Israel as a strong ally. They see a 2-state solution as critical to the future of Israel and the Palestinians, and they see democracy as a core value, both here in America as well as abroad. I think we're seeing, obviously there's some folks on the left that sympathize and have a lot of empathy towards the Palestinians and their right for self-determination. Some of that comes across in a way that is far out of the kind of traditional way that we talked about Israel-Palestine. And I think we're seeing some elites in the center of the kind of Jewish establishment, mostly in the Democratic majority for Israel, decide that they want to primary some of those voices in elections and try to keep them out of Congress, generally targeting women of color, for what it's worth. The GOP, I think, is a lot more splintered. I think there's a couple reasons. I mentioned democracy. I'm not so sure that Republicans care about democracy in the same way as Democrats do in today's hyper-partisan world. In the MAGA hijacked GOP, you see people, supporting the January 6th insurrection, repeating the big lie. We have votes like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that used to pass 99-1, and 0 Republicans voted for it. And I think this lack of respect for democracy and this move towards autocracy has changed how Republicans view foreign policy issues as well. You see Trump praising Putin. You see, the GOP, when it comes to Israel, more comfortable with an endless occupation and running away from even the 2-state solution, which has been the bipartisan consensus for decades. And I think it's complicated by not just where AIPAC is, but a whole host of groups, whether it's CUFI, which is the evangelical arm of ProIsrael, which is actually the largest ProIsrael group, Sheldon Adelson's kind of takeover of the Republican Jewish Committee, and others that have pushed some of the Republicans to the extreme and even pushed AIPAC further to the right as well. So we can, I don't want to talk for I think we'll get into this in some of the questions, but I think for those whose mission is to represent one view from the American Jewish community, that is completely bipartisan, there's no debate about it, is just not where the community is and not realistic anymore in Congress. And that's why we're seeing folks on the left, the right, and the center move away from each other.
Hey, Dan. So I had a question for you about the 2-state solution and its support or lack thereof in the Republican Party. for a long time, it seemed like a bipartisan, non-controversial thing. People would say, I support a two-state solution and kind of leave it at that. But Republican support really does seem to be waning. For example, Senator Ted Cruz blocked the Israel Relations Normalization Act from being considered by the Senate for like months and months and months due to his objections over the legislation's support for two states. Do you see this as an indication of further fissures between the parties on this and the Republican Party itself abandoning the two-state solution?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, which it would not be for a very interesting conversation. The caveat is, I'm not expert in internal GOP politics. The slightly longer answer, I think, goes to just two core values that have now been put through the partisan machines of Washington. One I already talked about a little bit, which is, democracy on one side versus this rise of authoritarianism that we're seeing here in the United States, most personified by Trump and the insurrectionists on January 6th. But also abroad, we're seeing it in what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. And I think the Democrats, desire to save democracy, to protect voting rights, to make sure elections are undermined, and the pushback on the Republican side, I think is now also manifesting itself abroad, including with Israel. So if you don't care as much about democracy, you might not care that there's 6 million Palestinians that don't have the same access to voting, to roads, to water, to electricity as the Israelis on the other side of the Green Line. So I think that's part of it. I think that we can't ignore, the systemic racism, which is another issue that obviously has been on the front of all of our minds for the last couple of years. We had the Black Lives Matter protests a couple summers ago. And I think you just see more and more in the Republican Party, let's start domestically, whether going back to the voting rights or passing programmatic things on healthcare and economy that help the poor and the working class, who tend to be more Black and brown folks. There's a lot more desire on the Democratic side than the Republican, not that we're completely faultless. And I think that is true when you talk about foreign affairs as well. We all care deeply and have been shocked by the images of the women and children leaving Ukraine. And on the Democratic side, you hear some of that same language and other conflicts, but I just don't hear Republicans talking about the Yemeni children that are starving, and it's the largest humanitarian crisis, soon to be surpassed by Ukraine, that we had before, from Saudi, bombings and bombardments with US weapons. You don't hear them talk about South Sudan, and you don't hear them talk about Gaza, and I need to, put out there, when race is not named, that's when racism flourishes. And I just think there's a different standard in how certain elected officials look at conflicts that involve Black and brown folks than they do with people that look or talk or seem more similar to the culture that we have here. So that's my short answer.
Thanks, Dan. Stacey, I want to come back to you. You said something interesting when you were talking about how, you think that the divisions we see on Capitol Hill are, of course, reflective of our community also. And so, you've worked over the years with a broad range of groups sort of across the spectrum, or at least a good chunk of the spectrum of Jewish world. And I'm curious if you think that the shift in Congress, is it also represented within the sort of organizational establishment? And do you think that those changes, right? Or do you think we're seeing that within our own organizations? And how is that reflecting, really?
Thanks, Hadar. I think, it depends. Dan was right. There used to be one formula, one go-to address to see how a group of people felt. And by the way, that's one of the things that made the Jewish community a great community to work with, because it was a group of people who could, quickly come together, a core set of issues, and you could figure out what this group of people wanted. So I think Jewish people more broadly you can see it in data, and we see it actually in our children. There are now generations of Jews who have lived as an empowered group of people. They've lived with a strong state of Israel. And I think among rank and file Jewish voters and Jewish activists, there's a real, a nuanced conversation at the level of people, right? There's, we all acknowledge that we're integrating our particular need for survival and security and equal rights. We are integrating it with a broader system of values and respect for pluralism that we want for everyone. And so I think rank and file Jews are integrating that. It's kind of a broad civic religion. But where you see the community getting more strident, I believe we're infected by what's been going on around us in our society. I worked on 3 different definitions of anti-Semitism in very different ways. And in engaging each of those definitions, I had groups of colleagues and friends who thought that I was terrible. I was as bad as our opponent, fill in the blank, sometimes the Russian, sometimes someone else. And we really do, we're very easily divided, and we're very quick to accuse someone that disagrees with us of saying, you don't represent my values. And we're not the only group of people that goes there. If you do organizing in progressive communities, you see it all the time. But so I think there's greater nuance by Jewish people. And I think that it's harder and harder for that nuance to be expressed in the organizational world. And remember, it's not always different views that divide people. It's what kind of institution are we in, right? Organizations, it's not a crime to say organizations have to raise money to do their good work, or organizations have to be accountable to their donors or their members. So I think we have a lot of different people with a lot of different goals. Electeds want to get reelected. Some people want to, are completely laser focused on a 2-state solution. Some people are laser focused on integrating Jews into racial justice work. So we have a big group of people with different goals, and we're no longer in a cohesive group with a more or less common agenda. And I think that accounts for a lot of the divisions.
Thank you, Stacey. Dan, I want to turn to you with another question. You mentioned AIPAC earlier, and I want to kind of go back to that. I think some of the conversation, obviously there's been a lot that's happened within the Republican Party around this, but I think something that's really reinvigorated this conversation has been the recent creation of the AIPAC PAC and their super PAC. And then, of course, there's subsequent endorsements of members of Congress who, some of whom voted against the certification of the 2020 presidential election. So having run J Street's PAC for many years and now working in a broader progressive political capacity, how do you think this development reflects the changing politics around Israel-Palestine? And how do you think this might impact it going forward?
Yeah, I think first to Stacey's point, I think it's good. We have different opinions. I think for a long time, what was quietly said, particularly in the organized Jewish community, was there's too few of us. We need to look out for American Jews. It's not okay for us we can have quiet conversations, but then when we present to electeds and to those in power, we need to have one view because it will be more powerful together. And the issue is when that view is not the mainstream view of the community that you're representing, I don't think that's helpful anymore. And I think having different voices is good. And, I actually commend AIPAC, for being public and saying, here's who we think are our champions. We're going to raise money for them. We're going to help get them elected. Because I think part of what AIPAC did in the 80s and 90s, and if you talk to Tom Dine or the other folks that were kind of part of the growth of that organization, is they did a lot of the political work in the shadows. The fundraising for elected officials, the work that they did in meetings, the trips that they took with them. And the goal was to create this idea of a bipartisan consensus. And they wanted, whenever someone saw a Jewish surname whether it's a constituent of theirs, a donor of theirs, a volunteer in their campaign. Like, they wanted to connect the idea that that Jewish constituent, that Jewish donor, is the same thing as an AIPAC donor, as a single issue voter in Israel, which we know Jews are not, and that you need to take our talking points or you will lose support. So for the first time in, are they 60 or 70 years old now, they publicly endorsed candidates for Congress. And of course, they needed to show a bipartisan list, which meant a couple problematic things for them. They endorsed a bunch of Democrats who don't agree with them, particularly on Iran, right? The biggest campaign that has been consistent from AIPAC for decades is that Iran's about to get a nuclear weapon. It's funny that they're about to get it for decades. And that if you can't negotiate with them and we need to sanction them until they stop. Well, almost every Democrat in Congress voted against that, and they're still on the list as an AIPAC champion. A lot of them are upset by that, and they probably weren't even told before they showed up on the list. We can get into that later. On the Republican side, it meant endorsing 37 GOP members that, after the insurrection, voted to not certify the election results. These are people that adhere to the big lie, that say that the Jim Jordans of the world, that say that, January 6th was just another touristy day on the mall. And I just think it's really problematic. Democracy and justice, these are core Jewish values, these are core democratic values, these are core progressive values. And I think it was right for a lot of the other Jewish and pro-Israel groups to say, we're not going to support anyone that is, outwardly calling for a coup and not a peaceful transfer of power, no matter what their position is on Israel. I don't care if they support aid to Israel. I don't care their view on Iran. If you're not going to support the basic tenets of democracy, you don't belong in a list. And I'll tell you, a lot of those Democratic officials are not very happy to be on a list with Jim Jordan and friends. And so I think AIPAC, since they hadn't done this in their 70-year history, probably should have talked to a lot of our other organizations that have been doing endorsements and supporting candidates for decades, like Move On, in how to properly put together a process, how to roll this out, and how to do it in a way that made elected officials feel good about it instead of causing a lot of trouble both in the press and at home in their districts.
So I want to follow up on this for a second, because, and then, Stacey, you and Madeline, if you want to add, please do. The AIPAC, once we get past making fun of them for naming their PAC the AIPAC PAC, which is like a, Dr. Seuss story, but anyway, like you said, they sort of came out of the shadows. Instead of using the network of state and local, regional PACs who've done this work, they've decided to do it in their own name. I'm with you. I think that's great. They have every right to do that. The two things that you touched on that stand out, though, and I don't know, I don't speak for them, so I can't say if they did this on purpose or by accident, but first of all, obviously the decision to endorse those 37 insurrectionists and what that means to, okay, you're a single issue org, like you said, but where's that line? How far are you willing to go? And also just process-wise, I mean, Dan, you sort of just alluded to it, but, I've had these conversations, I know you have, and others have too. There are multiple members of Congress who found out that they were endorsed by the AIPAC PAC on Twitter, right? They saw it on social media, or they saw it when people started calling them saying, hey, I'm surprised that you took this endorsement. And some of them, and I will leave their names out, but some of them are people who have publicly committed to not sponsoring legislation on any topic with folks who refuse to endorse the the election results with the insurrectionists. And so again, whether it was intentional, unintentional, the fact that that's how they went ahead and did this to sort of demonstrate the bipartisanship, to me actually just gives, shines light on how much of, frankly, not a lie, because that implies very intentional, but how untrue the bipartisanship is these days. That on the one hand, you have to ignore the insurrectionist tendencies of 37 of these. On the other hand, a whole bunch of these people, you didn't even ask them, you didn't even tell them you were going to do this, which again, as Dan knows, having done this, and I have as well in the past, when you run a PAC, you have a process. You talk to candidates, you talk about shared goals, shared values, you talk about what the PAC's going to do, and you come together and have a decision. Usually you've got a board process about who you're endorsing. It is, certainly in my years in Washington, I've never heard of a PAC endorsing candidates without talking to them about it.
Never.
And I think it shines a light on how different things are from where they used to be. And
Just
Dan, you look at
one point on the insurrectionist piece.
Okay, yeah.
A lot of companies like AT&T, like corporations, also single issue, right, which is profit. They said, back in January, we're not going to give to insurrectionists. They're on the committees we care about. We're a telecom company. We need to speak to these members of Congress because, they will impact the regulation of the industry that we represent. Let's take it away. Let's put it straight in corporations. Some of them have started to bend on that, and there's a lot of great corporate campaigning for Move On and others to hold those companies accountable to that. But I think to say you're single issue, and so you can endorse people that are like, trying to run a coup is just ridiculous. And it's a talking point that reminds me of the NRA, that we're a single issue group, so we don't care.
Well,
I wouldn't want an NRA endorsement. I'm okay not getting, I think AT&T should not give money to insurrectionists, and I think AIPAC shouldn't. I just think there's a red line there that is just beyond the pale from my perspective.
Stacey.
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, AIPAC wrote the book on effective Grasstops advocacy. It's a model that everyone has tried to emulate. They're a single issue organization. And in so many ways, they've never had to face these questions before, right? My old boss, Abe Foxman, who criticized the endorsements, every day of his leadership at ADL, he had to have a system of priorities, and it involved a lot of tough choices. And it would have been easier if ADL only could do what was good for Jewish people, but that wasn't the work. And I think AIPAC is in new territory, not in the sense that they've always been a single issue organization, but so much of their work is more out there. In other words, it's a boost for transparency. AIPAC always carefully differentiated their advocacy work from the political involvement of their donors. And once you have a PAC, your sort of tacit approval of, let's just say, the insurrectionists, because they supported your position on Israel, is now something that's out in the public eye. It's being scrutinized. I think the debate about this is healthy. AIPAC is no stranger to criticism, and they can answer for themselves. It's a significant and highly professional organization. But I think these are very healthy questions that this PAC is surfacing. Is the same order of priorities for AIPAC from 1951, does it still make sense today? And then I think, Dan, what you were saying about other organizations, the president and director of AIPAC talked about issues like abortion. And I think, we all know that people of good faith differ on abortion, differ on gun rights, differ on grain elevator bankruptcy reform. But I think for most Jews and for a very broad swath of the constituency that has always embraced AIPAC, there can't be two sides to this issue. And I think that, January 6th tested us in an unprecedented way, and it's testing AIPAC's model. So I view the public debate about this as healthy. And, I think all of us have been asking the question for a long time. Working at ADL, I represented a community whose advocacy had been successful. And we had to ask ourselves questions all the time about, do we use our levers of power all the time? Do we use it sometimes? When do we share it with other people? And what's the system of decision-making? What are our priorities? And how is our order of priorities different from another Jewish organization or another civil rights group? And those are really healthy questions. I will say that, AIPAC publicly said this is no moment for the pro-Israel movement to be selective about its friends. And I think it's fair for people to say, maybe this is a moment. Maybe AIPAC did amazing work building the architecture of an incredible US-Israel relationship. But I think for a lot of Jews engaged on these issues, they feel like maybe we can weigh these questions. There's not one answer.
I would love to just add a little bit more on that idea of, defending this decision, or AIPAC defending its decision as, really being a single issue organization. And to me, I mean, this is an organization that claims to represent the Jewish community. And I think there's a real dissonance, especially when we're talking about January 6th. This is an issue that impacts the Jewish community. Like, I think we're all, for me anyways, but I think for all of us, like the images of that day are seared on our minds, right? We can picture the man with the shirt that said 6 million weren't enough, right? We know that, among the people who voted after this is Representative Scott Perry, who later on that year promoted anti-Semitic replacement theory on the House floor. So for AIPAC to say, we care about Israel, this is what we're doing, that's all we care about, and equate it to, supporting abortion rights is ridiculous, because they're not a telecom company, they're an organization that claims to represent Jews. And it is unsafe for Jews to have members of Congress in office who tacitly support people who believe in these types of theories.
There's a lot in that. Yeah, so Madeline, I want to pick up off of that and take us, I actually think the AIPAC PAC and endorsements is a reflection of what's happening in Congress. In this case, less so than the cause of, although obviously AIPAC's influence overall on the issue is big. And I think, you mentioned earlier Ted Cruz, holding up legislation because he objected to the two-state solution. It's fascinating. We see it with Jewish organizations, but we see it with members of Congress and other folks too. When you ask them for sort of their views on Israel-Palestine, and you try to get them to identify sort of where they are on this, one default answer that we've gotten for a long time is, well, I support a two-state solution. And obviously, I think that's good, but many of you have probably heard me say this before. I also think that was a great question to ask in 1993, right? The question now is like, what are you gonna do about it? And if you say you support a two-state solution, yet you are unwilling to support, I don't know, the Two-State Solution Act or any other piece of legislation. I pick that one because obviously it's got those words in the name, but so many other pieces of legislation that are attempting to move us toward that, or attempting to keep that, frankly, as a viable option on the table, and keep that from no longer being even a possibility. And I think just claiming in the void that you support two states is not, frankly, the most significant thing anymore. That being said, I also think it's fascinating that we're actually seeing Cruz is not alone. More and more Republicans who actually won't even say they support a two-state. And so, like Stacey said earlier, we're seeing a fracturing in all sorts of different directions. And, Dan was saying, for folks who aren't supporting democracy here in the US, they're certainly not that concerned about it for Israelis, much less Palestinians. And I think we just are seeing a moment where I think we as a community need a different question, right? Do you support two states as sort of the check mark of are you on this team or that team? I think doesn't do it anymore. And I'm just curious, Stacey and Dan and Madeline, of course, too, like, have you heard that from other members or from congressional offices? Because it seems like the actual bigger shift to me has been on the Republican side of moving away from two states, but we don't hear it as much. Stacey, Dan, either of you? Madeline, anybody?
I can speak to Democrats, who I talk to all the time. I don't talk to a lot of Republicans. The way a member of Congress works is they surround themselves with staff whose job is to be risk averse, right? You don't want to do anything that makes negative news, that can cause controversy, that can make some waves back home that could cost you votes or donors or volunteers for your next campaign because you want to be reelected forever, which is the general goal of most Congress people, not to make change. And so I just, what I hear, and it's not just on the Israel issue, but it's particularly true on the Israel issue, is most of the 435 members of Congress didn't go there to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not their core issue. They don't see themselves as experts on it. And so they look to their staff to say, tell me what to say that will get me in the least amount of trouble. And for a couple decades, that was whatever AIPAC sent you. And now for most of them, it's like, oh, AIPAC sent me this and J Street sent me that. Can we write something that's in the middle? Right? And like, it's not based on policy considerations. It's not even based on like the actual political considerations, because most decisions in Washington are made around what's called mythic power. Like when SEIU, which is one of the Service Employees International Union, sends an email saying we support the Build Back Better Act, the members of the Congress staff don't say, well, how much did they spend in the last election? Oh, it was 120 million. Well, which districts was that in? They just know SEIU is a big, powerful union, like AIPAC's a big, powerful organization. So, and they email me a lot, so I better listen to them. And I just think that's kind of how the issue plays out. It's still something that people just don't want to get in trouble on, except a core few, both on, let's say, the Dan Kalick side of the issue versus some other side of the issue that really care about this and are pushing it forward. And I think that's why we've had some trouble getting people on the Levin Two-State Solution Act, which I think is a good vehicle.
Yeah.
I also think that our community is a proxy. In other words, our issues can be a pretext, especially for Republicans. There are Republicans who look at, let's say, why they were hesitant to support Deborah Lipstadt. And I'm not talking about any of the one personal sort of issue, but people frequently will say, well, that person is not, or that position is not strident enough for me on anti-Semitism or Israel issues. And I believe that that's a pretext in a lot of cases for an elected to do what they want to do in any case, which is to attack Ilhan Omar and the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi, or stand in the way of a Biden nominee, or to support, a fellow colleague. And I think our issues get used, and no one calls that out. It's very difficult to do, to say, no, Senator, this isn't what you meant. And so,
also you are a white supremacist. Yeah.
I think that, it gets used and you can never say it. And I also think that advocates and organizations, again, a lot of advocates say, I myself am nuanced, or I myself, let's say, vote for Republicans and Democrats in my lifetime. But when they're in those conversations with those members who just want to run with an issue for political and substantive reasons, or just political reasons, no one says you're doing a disservice to the community right now. It's just, that is a gap.
But the goal is to scare these electeds, to go back to my position where they tell me all the time, like, oh, how can I write the thing to not get in trouble? And the more that there's attacks coming from the right to the left on this, the more people are scared to talk about it. And I'm looking through the list. I see my mom's on the call. Hi, Mom. And I think it's the same microcosm in her. My mom runs the Jewish Film Festival in New Hampshire. And they showed a film that's showed in 60 other film festivals across the country, but a Palestinian, created the film. And it required 7 board conversations to decide if they can show it. Do they need to have a conversation after? Who can be in the conversation? Are Palestinians even real people? And that shutting down of debate in local communities, even in New Hampshire, it's the same thing that's happening at a much larger scale in Congress and in the White House.
Yes, Madeline.
Awesome. Hi, Dan's mom. So I wanted to go back, Stacey, you mentioned Deborah Lipstadt, and I think, that's a really interesting example of the debate we've seen around anti-Semitism in recent years in Congress as well, and the partisanship. And I'm just curious if you think this where you think this hyperpartisanship stems from. I mean, even you said you worked on 3 different definitions, and even that is very polarizing. And so, yeah, where do you think this comes from, and how do you see it playing out in the future?
I'm optimistic about the future, but I'll start with where I think it comes from. I think these are meta trends, whether it's the fundraising environment, the way politicians have to appeal to the most strident part of their base. Organizations have to, in many ways, appeal to the more strident part of their donor base. I think we are caught up in a really caustic debate that just stifles nuance, rewards mean tweets. I think I am optimistic because I believe that these issues ultimately are framed by the Jewish community. And our community is filled with people who are in a deeply moral conversation about how the pluralism, how Palestinian rights, how religious tolerance, and even tolerance for people, to the right of us or to the left of us. I mean, I see people being more and more generous with each other. I consider APN an organization that models that, and sometimes, steps out of the lane just to express what you think is right, even if it may not be popular in one or another jet stream that you swim in. And I think when we fill the public debate with critical thinking, if we don't like how some organizations are interpreting what we want or what we stand for, compete. Put your ideas out there. People are listening. And even though in politics, what you want is a single message, Senate, Congress, White House, here's what this group wants you to do. I think for now we're in a period of transition. And I do think groups like APN are modeling how does all of that fit together? What's the picture of us? How do we show up?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And obviously I started this call saying that I'm part of this community with you, and taking a Jewish lens to my work and the values from that is really important. And why is it that this issue always centers Jews? There's millions of Palestinians, there's millions of Iranians. I was on a call with the White House the other day. It was off the record, but I think I can say it happened, about the potential of re-entering the Iran nuclear agreement. 9 of the 10 people on the call were white Jewish dudes. None of us spoke Farsi, none of us have ever been to Iran. I haven't even worked on the issue in 4 years. Why is it that whenever we talk about issues, anything related to the Middle East, anything that could be related to Israel, we get a bunch of white Jewish men around and decide what the right policy is? I would much rather that my Iranian American colleague, who does equal, if not more work on foreign policy at MoveOn, Mana, had been invited to at least give some perspective from the Iranian diaspora about, what an issue that impacts, her homeland, one that, she came, after the revolution and, doesn't like the current government there, but still, it's amazing how in DC, how I continuously find these conversation in rooms where the gender and the, ethnic and religious folks is so myopic, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah. Dan, you just mentioned, her not liking the government there. I think plenty of us have experience with being here and not necessarily liking other governments to which we feel attached to those nations. And actually, I'm going to take a couple of the questions that we got on the Q&A sort of together around this, that we have been talking, mostly about the American Jewish community and the interaction with Congress as it relates to Israel, but we haven't really talked about how the political shifts over the last 20 years or so now in Israel have impacted that, right? We've seen a very steady rightward drift of government after government after government. Obviously, this last one is, I think, objectively not as right in the entirety of who makes up the government, but we all know that's complicated. Do do you think, and this is really for both of you, do you think that change in the Israeli politics has impacted the change that we've been talking about among Republicans and among Democrats? Or, and I'll say, or do you think that's still more driven by the domestic considerations? Anybody want to start with that, Stacey?
I'm happy to say it's just a stubborn fact that during the Oslo process, when there is a government that is leaning forward to make peace, in general, I think that those efforts are well received in Congress. I think this new coalition is kind of a refresh in the relationship in Congress. I think, it was very controversial for FDR to run for a third term. There are good reasons in international relations why it's not always good to have the same prime minister for a long time. So I think we're definitely in a refresh mode now.
No, I mean, the only thing I'll say is, to the extent that being pro-Israel means being aligned with the current Israeli government, if you see a rightward shift in the Israeli government, you'll see a reflection of that in the pro-Israel community in the United States. From my perspective, supporting Israel doesn't mean supporting the current government. The same way when Trump was president, the most patriotic thing I could do was quit my job, go to Move On, and be a part of the resistance that helped push back against his attacks on his community and on democracy and on everything that I believe in. So I think that can apply to Israel as well. I want Israel to have a border that's recognized by its neighbor. I want Israel to have normalized relationships throughout the Arab and Muslim world. I want Israel to not have to deal with both the social, economic, and political constraints of occupying millions of people in perpetuity. I think it makes them stronger. I think it makes them, a more successful and democratic place to live for Israelis and everyone around them. So, I think if you can decouple love of government from love of country and people, I think that's really important, both in our own domestic politics here and how we relate what it means to support Israel as their friends in America.
Yeah, I think, we've seen over many years where both members of Congress have said, oh, well, I support whatever the government of Israel says, which is actually, for me, I think where we first saw Republicans being willing to publicly say they didn't support two states anymore was, going back up to Netanyahu's annexation efforts, and even pieces before that of Netanyahu, who largely would still say he supported two states, but then taking a bunch of actions where they would say, look, I'm just, following that dude's lead over there. But the truth is that also connects. I mean, they're not separate pieces to the domestic politics. I mean, Stacey talked about rightly how when there have been, efforts to move toward peace, they've been well received in Congress. They haven't always been well received across the entirety of the Jewish community. And we know, going back to Oslo, again, to go back to our colleagues at AIPAC, while their line has always been supporting whatever the government of Israel says, the reality is they did not support that effort. They did not support Rabin. Frankly, when the Israel Policy Forum was created, because there were American Jewish leaders who wanted to have an organization that was doing that. And so those things clearly still overlap. And I think how members of Congress see things is a reflection both of what's happening on the ground there and in leadership there, but also in the community here. Madeline, I know you had another question.
I know we're running low on time. We did have a question in the chat from a little bit earlier about, polling and what percentage of registered Democrats voted for Trump in 2020 because of Israel. And just generally what the constituency looks like of Jewish Americans when it comes to.
I mean, I've commissioned during my J Street years, probably more polls on the American Jewish community than anyone. I've read all the polls that other people commissioned, even if you think ours were biased. And the more that we polled, the more things look the same. And it doesn't matter if you poll nationally, if you poll in Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, we polled everywhere. And there is no swing vote among American Jews. It is basically 70% are Democrat, 30% are Republican. I know Stacey says it's a lot about Israel. I think taxes also are another big issue, For those that are on the Republican side, they want lower taxes for, reasonable reasons. I disagree with them on that. I think people should pay their fair share. But there's very, very little swing vote. Israel's not a voting issue. It's a threshold issue. So once people say, oh yeah, Israel's an ally, great. Tell me where you are in healthcare, tell me where in the economy, tell me where you're on voting rights. And so I would say that, I think AIPAC and the right's political operation has actually been a huge mistake if your goal is to get more Republican Jewish voters. If you wanted more Republican Jews to switch to Republican, even though there's been no shift in 70 years for the most part, you should be talking about taxes, you should be talking about the economy, you should be talking about a vision for America and why your conservative leadership will bring you there. The more you talk about Israel or Palestine, it doesn't matter. It's like a complete waste of your time. We all care about Israel. We have cousins in Israel. We have friends that live there, but we understand that as a candidate, you're kosher, you pass the test, tell me where you are and everything else. And so I think that the idea of the single issue Jewish voter and the idea that there's this swing vote that we need to fight for in Florida every 4 years makes some Jewish consultants a lot of money, but it's complete bullshit.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, first of all, Dan, I think the issue, I talked about Israel as a pretext for some Republican lawmakers. I think there are Jewish voters in Florida who would like their taxes to be lower, but they say, I'm voting for Republican because I'm scared Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon. So the pretext works both ways. And the one thing I know there is data showing that when Jewish voters, when we close the curtain, we are voting on healthcare and issues that other Americans are concerned about. But that data is a little bit deceptive because once Israel or anti-Semitism or one of the polarizing issues we deal with becomes a flashpoint publicly, suddenly that issue is a number one and everybody's commenting on it and it can hurt a candidate. So it may not be a voting booth issue on a quiet day, but it can.
Can I just push back a little bit on that, Stacey?
Yeah.
During 2015, during the Iran nuclear fight, AIPAC set up a $35 million campaign. And people were told, if you vote for this against AIPAC's number one issue, you will never work in this town again. And every single person that voted it won their election. So again, it goes back to this mythic power that like somehow this like scary organization is going to come and primary and you're going to lose forever. And no one lost. I just think it's the more we repeat the myth, the more it becomes true. I'm telling you, I spent decades of my life trying to swing Jewish voters towards Democrats and progressives, and it was a waste of my time. And I recommend going after new surge voters that came out in 2018 and 2020 for the first time of Biden. That's the whole game in this election cycle. And if we can get those disinterested but very online voters to come out, that's our only chance as Democrats for saving the Senate and the House. And I don't recommend either side talks about anything foreign policy related outside of Ukraine.
So thank you for that. Thank you. I will say APN, of course, is not engaging in electoral work, but we are happy to learn from the expertise of others who still are. And Stacey, I want to go back to one of the things you said before we wrap things up here, which is, Dan, what is going on? Sorry about that little distraction there. There's the threshold issue, but as we know, and we've only got another minute for this, so my apologies, but so much more frequently now, the Israel and anti-Semitism is very intentionally becoming the same debate and the same thing. And I think it will be interesting to see as an election issue, right, whether that's different now, because whether it was one thing when there might be a member of Congress who you thought was, left of where you wanted them to be on Israel-Palestine things and did radical things like, I don't know, said Palestine. But if you now believe, as I think a lot of people are believing and are trying to create a sense where this is the case, that person and those views are now anti-Semitic. Stacey, do you think that we're going to see more of that in terms of the messaging from candidates and from elected officials? I'm not talking about just in elections in general.
I think a lot of that is in our hands. I mean, when APN endorsed the Deborah Lipstadt for the envoy job, I think it's incredibly impactful when progressive or liberal Zionists, or however people want to self-identify, engage these issues, when the only people engaging issues are very far to the right or very far to the left, we're not represented. And so I think those issues will come up, but I think we have an opportunity to push back and to call it out, and also represent ourselves as a principled group of people, because the conflation of those two issues is just wrong.
Great. Well, listen, we could keep this conversation going forever, but we are at our time. So I want to thank our guests first. Stacey, thank you very much. Dan, thank you very much. As always, Madeline, thank you. And importantly, I want to thank everybody who joined us for this conversation. Again, we'll put the video up on our YouTube page, and we will share the podcast Peacecast episode. So to be continued. Thanks.